Malaysia and Singapore, Prime Minister Lawrence, continue to deepen our cooperation across the board. This I prepared before I know that you are going to attend. So it's a very sincere expression. One example is the Johor-Singapore Special Economic Zone, an economic partnership designed to boost investment, innovation, and connectivity between Singapore and southern Malaya. In a world increasingly shaped by fractures and fault lines, we aim to offer a different kind of border, one defined not by division, but by shared purpose. If this Johor-Singapore Special Zone is a glimpse of what cooperation can achieve at the bilateral level, then ASEAN is the wider canvas. The 46th ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur held last week was substantive and productive. We adopted the KL Declaration on ASEAN 2045, a 20-year roadmap to knit our region closer together with jobs, connectivity, and sustainability at its core. This is the kind of groundwork on which lasting security is built. We made the historic decision to admit Timor-Leste as ASEAN's 11th member, with formal admission expected at the summit in October. Now, the situation in Myanmar remains grave, but we are not standing still. ASEAN does not seek to engineer outcomes, but we are equally clear that the 5-point consensus dictates that a resolution that excludes those most affected by this crisis will not endure. Myanmar's nationhood must be forged through inclusion, not erasure. Beyond our borders, ASEAN is widening its strategic aperture. The ASEAN GCC Summit deepened ties with the Gulf. This week's launch of the ASEAN GCC China Trilateral Initiative, unprecedented and momentous, reflects our intent to connect ASEAN's energy and talent with the Gulf's capital and China's scale. New tools like the ASEAN Geoeconomics Task Force are helping us navigate external shocks with sharper coordination and foresight. And while such headlines matter, the real strength lies in what happens beneath them, or what happens within us, as in what Tocqueville describes as the habits of the heart. Rituals that help to establish and sustain democratic institutions with a coherent moral ethos. And that gives us habits of cooperation, trade facilitation, cybersecurity frameworks, cross-border data rules, cultural cooperation. They may not be as dramatic, but they are no less vital, for they give Southeast Asia greater impetus to work together. And the more we act together, the harder it becomes to be pulled apart by external gravity. Preserving our autonomy is not about resisting others. It is about strengthening ourselves. This, in essence, is what ASEAN centrality is about. The same spirit shaped the ASEAN leaders' statement on global and economic and trade uncertainty. We warn of the dangers of unilateral actions, retaliatory tariffs, and the growing risk of global fragmentation. We affirm ASEAN's commitment to an open, predictable, and rules-based trading system, not because it is expedient, but because it is essential. Southeast Asia is not new to globalization. We are one of its original crossroads. From the trade routes of Malacca Sultanate, Majapahit empires, kingdoms across Southeast Asia, to the data centers of today, our region has long depended on openness to goods, capital, ideas, and people. This openness has anchored our prosperity, established our politics, and strengthened regional cohesion. What holds true for us holds true elsewhere. Where trade flourishes, stability follows. When it falters, the consequences ripple far beyond any one region. Economic openness is not just about creating prosperity and growth. It is a source of equilibrium, both between nations and within them, to deal with pressing issues that affect the people, such as poverty, social inequities, or even digital divide. Open markets create the kind of mutual exposure between nations that encourages caution, not confrontation. And when this system is disrupted, markets lose their bearings. Investor confidence wavers while financial flows seize up. What began as a commercial rupture becomes a systemic shock. History reminds us that these shifts are rarely gradual. This commitment reflects the realities we face every day as open, export-driven economies, deeply connected to global markets. For countries like ours, fragmented trade raises costs, lower resilience, and depressed investments. Currency volatility and investor flight do not respect borders, and disruptions in energy, food, or critical minerals cascade quickly through societies. We are therefore under no illusion about the security challenges ahead. But in Southeast Asia, we have learned that lasting stability begins with steady fundamentals, clear policies, and a long view. Trade is not a soft power indulgence. It is part of our strategic architecture. And like any critical system, it must be protected not from competition, but from the onslaught of arbitrary imposition of trade restrictions. All this talk about trade does not mean that we are oblivious to the hard security challenges facing our region. Voltaire famously observed that optimism is the madness of insisting that all is well when we are miserable. This is undeniably a sobering moment in history. The number of armed conflicts is now at its highest since the end of the Second World War. From war in Ukraine, to genocide in Gaza, to civil strife in Myanmar, Sudan, and the Sahel. We must not allow selective outrage or strategic fatigue to dull our moral clarity. Indeed, the genocide in Gaza is a test of our collective conscience, the scale of devastation, the open defiance of humanitarian norms, and the paralysis of institutions meant to uphold them demand more than sympathy. They demand consistency and action. The new orthodoxy affects not just how we view diplomacy, but how we structure security. If persuasion is dismissed as weakness, then exclusivity becomes strategy. We do not object to like-minded partners talking about among themselves, but coalitions that build walls instead of bridges, stoke arms competition, or undermine the legitimacy of multilateralism should give us pause. A stable region is not one braced for conflict, but one grounded in openness, transparency, and habit-forming cooperation. We understand that nations need a degree of control over their defense industries and critical infrastructure. We recognize that a measure of deterrence helps keep all parties honest. It is with that realism in mind that Malaysia adopts a posture of active non-alignment to preserve our ability to act on our terms. It is a deliberate way to remain outward-facing, connected, and in control of our strategic space. The suggestion that we do not necessarily align fully with one side, then we must have capitulated to the other is untenable. Nowhere is this more evident than in the prevailing discourse on the South China Sea, where the dispute is far too complex. Our objective is not achieved through escalation, nor by provoking others into disproportionate responses. It is best pursued through steady, principled diplomacy, quiet where necessary, but always firm. Malaysia remains deeply concerned about the potential for escalation among the claimants in the South China Sea. We have no interest in seeing tensions spiral into confrontation, least of all in waters so critical to our own security and prosperity. That is why we will continue to engage with all parties calmly, directly, consistently. We will urge restraint, encourage dialogue, and work to preserve the stability on which this region depends. Above all, we remain steadfast in our principled insistence that all parties uphold the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, Malaysia does not believe in spheres of influence. History has shown that when major powers attempt to divide the world into exclusive zones of control, smaller nations are often left voiceless. Stability does not come from carving up the map, but from creating space for all to participate meaningfully in shaping the order we live in. Our approach is one of active non-alignment. We will engage all who are willing, major powers and middle powers alike, not to set one against the other, but to maximize our own strategic space. Indeed, while we welcome a strong and enduring United States presence in the region towards fostering peace, we also value our vibrant and firm ties with China and our robust partnership across Asia, Europe, and the Global South. What Southeast Asia needs is a dynamic equilibrium that enables cooperation without coercion and a balance without bloc politics. For Malaysia, this is a deliberate and strategic posture to help preserve an open region, to assert our sovereignty, and to make our own choices. Terima kasih. Thank you.
Prime Minister, thank you very much for that thoughtful, principled, elegant, and strategic presentation, rich in strategic epigrams, if I can put it that way, how habits of the heart could lead to habits of cooperation, the importance of trade in encouraging caution rather than confrontation, your wonderful reflection that trade is not a soft power indulgence, your reaffirmation of the importance in a dynamic environment of active non-alignment, and your call not to permit strategic fatigue to dull our sense of moral purpose, and your combination of geoeconomics and geopolitical reflections will have been wonderfully received by the delegates here. You kindly agreed to take 4 or 5 questions, so what I think I will do, with your permission, is invite 4 or 5 to pose them, and then you can respond to those as they come on. But if
we have agreed that easy ones I will respond. The more complex one, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong will respond.
You always have powers of delegation that you can exercise if you wish. And let me start with one of our young leaders from the Philippines, Robert Joseph Medillo.
Thank you very much for your very insightful, principled, and inspiring remarks, Prime Minister. My question is about the Laconia Shoal. Malaysia has been actively exploring and exploiting oil and gas resources in the area around the shoal, as it is rightfully part of its continental shelf, and it is within its exclusive economic zone. China has, of course, made an open criticism of Malaysia regarding this issue based on its illegal 10-dash line. Your Excellency, what is Malaysia's most recent view or position about this issue? How are you handling this considering your robust economic relations with China? What are the challenges and or progress made, if any, to date? Thank you very much, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. And from Myanmar, what
It's a bit Lawrence of me now.
Oh.
No, wait, I'm talking.
Thank you,
as a
Mr.
friend.
Chairman.
I'm sorry. The foreign minister is not here, so I'm fine. Now,
I thought we would take 2 or 3 if we could,
Okay, all right.
and give you
Thank
time to compose an answer to them. So, Kyo Get Aung from Myanmar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for your thoughtful remark. So I have the 2 questions regarding the Myanmar, so possible election. So in Myanmar, the State Administration Council has indicated plan to hold their election under their constitutional and the electoral framework. So what will be the Malaysia position as the ASEAN chair on any possible election conducted by the SAC? And there is another scenario, if the China and some other ASEAN member states choose to endorse their SAC organized election, how will the Malaysia as an ASEAN chair respond to such division within the bloc? Thank you.
Thank you. And from China, Chi Zhang.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. In your speech, you emphasize the ASEAN centrality. Nowadays, however, the United States is imposing high tariff upon ASEAN countries, trying to press them to take side. So, as the leader of the rotating chair of ASEAN, what can you do to make sure that ASEAN continues to play a central role in the region? Thank you.
I'll take one more perhaps before coming back to the Prime Minister. Gatra Priyandita from Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chairman, and thank you, Prime Minister Anwar, for your remarks. My question is about international governance of cyberspace and emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, which is a subject that has been very important for Malaysia's chairmanship of ASEAN, but also more broadly in its engagement with the UN framework. More states are now developing cyber capabilities, and more militaries are now developing lethal autonomous weapons. There are a lot of concerns, obviously, about their growing use outside of legal and ethical frameworks. When there's growing distrust in cyberspace and about the uses of these kinds of technologies, and when there's a decline in trust in multilateral mechanisms, how can Malaysia, as well as more broadly ASEAN, make sure that states are held more accountable in cyberspace and the use of lethal autonomous weapons? Thank you.
I'll add one more to the Prime Minister's menu as he writes that question down. Susanna Patton from Australia.
Thank you. Mr. Prime Minister, you mentioned the importance of ASEAN holding its collective strength and unity. There is one ASEAN country that has been particularly on the daily front line of coercion within its exclusive economic zone by a much larger neighbour, China, and that is the Philippines. I'm interested if you think there is anything more that ASEAN could do to show solidarity with Manila.
I think we have 6 or 7 items on your menu. Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
You're not going to help me on this, right? Now, on the South China Sea, the consensus within ASEAN is UNCLOS, number 1. Number 2, to define it further, we agreed that there should be a code of conduct. And in 2 years back, I think in the session in Jakarta, Premier Lee Chiang made that commitment too. So we have to proceed towards that. That means there has been this sort of understanding. We're working towards that code of conduct to make sure that the explorations, the interests of countries be protected, and other countries, including China or United States or other countries, also respect that parameters. And right now, of course, there is no real clarity on exact point of reference. Now, this relates to even the issue of tension between Philippines and China, although I think, frankly, it's a bit more exaggerated because I've seen my friend, President Momo Marcos and Lee Chiang engaging, during the ASEAN meet in Kuala Lumpur. We hope that continues because there is no way out except the engagement between countries, and we do support that position. I've mentioned this to President Bomo Marcos, that the engagement must be more constant and dynamic, so that we should refrain from escalating this sort of tension. It's not easy, but then that has been the consensus within ASEAN, both bilateral and multilateral mechanisms. Now, on Myanmar, after consulting my colleagues, ASEAN, I met both SEC and also NUG prime ministers. And that was a precondition before we continue or enlarge our support for the humanitarian crisis. As I've said, Smart Team of Singapore was the first to arrive purely on a humanitarian basis. We, Malaysia, set up even the field hospital there. But the conditions, number one, immediate ceasefire, all sides. Number two, the humanitarian assistance must be given to all without a discrimination. All those two terms were agreed upon, then we proceed. Of course, there had been complaints about incidences of violence, again, the spirit of ceasefire. But we have continued, and I think recently the spirit of ASEAN leaders is to call for continued ceasefire, expanded, and guarantee the safety of all humanitarian personnel and their assistance. And hopefully this would allow for dialogue. We have taken the initiative to invite some groups for dialogue in Kuala Lumpur last month. And I've started, and I call my colleagues to send their teams, officials and military personnel and intelligence to continue to engage. But the parameters are very clear, the 5-point consensus. Now, about the elections, if the elections are fair and more inclusive, you do not exclude parties, then of course we are ready to accept, although it may not be perfect. You can't have sometimes we impose too stringent conditions. We joke about fair and free elections, and you can ask Al Gore in the 2000 elections. Of course, he would not agree with us, but then that's a position. But at least the broad parameters must be agreed upon. And this I have conveyed personally to the SEC Senior General Prime Minister of SEC, and also to the NUG Prime Minister. I do not want to preclude any possibility, but of course, elections is not the priority as far as we're concerned. First is peace and security. Second, humanitarian assistance. Number three is, of course, to have built up this consensus and be more inclusive. You can't have, for example, elections if you exclude some parties. Now, from Indonesia, Indonesia about the cyber space, cyber security, digital transformation, enrichment, and connectivity is all. It has become a major priority among ASEAN officials and leaders. We have announced from part of Malaysia, of course, we have continued. Singapore began this initiative about the proper adequate legislation much earlier. We have studied these cases, and then we'll be tabling legislations to this effect, and we have also encouraged member countries to do likewise to accelerate the process. Now, on the tariff, our consensus again, the trade ministers met and the finance ministers, we say no retaliatory tariffs. It will not work. It is better to listen and to engage. Bilaterally, countries have gone, but as ASEAN, we say, look, we have to have a consensus so that no decisions or recommendations come at the expense of any other partner. But the best method is still engagement. Nobody is certain what the final outcome will be, so it is better to be engaged. And the initial engagement, even from the engagement, even from the Malaysian MITI minister, they were quite happy meeting Natning and the USTR. There were rooms to maneuver and discuss in detail, so we'll proceed at that. But principally, we all in ASEAN agree that we support a rule-based multilateral system and arrangements. So we do not support, endorse any unilateral action against the principle of free trade. But notwithstanding that, the option is to continue to engage. I mean, best bilaterally, but also ASEAN as a group. I think I've covered almost all, right?
Prime Minister, you've done a comprehensive and wonderful job. You will have pleased our keynote speaker, President Macron, last night by quoting not only de Tocqueville but also Voltaire. But you will have satisfied the strategic appetite of all of our delegates here by your very wise speech, which I hope we will have access to so that we can read and study it. And thank you for the conversation that you so elegantly encouraged. Thank you very much, Prime Minister.